The thing to understand, though, about the Sea of Galilee is that the Sea of Galilee is known for the sudden storms because of its location. The Sea of Galilee is more than 600 feet below sea level. It is surrounded by great mountains, and the rivers have cut deep ravines down into the sea that tend to act like great funnels that draw cold winds down from the mountains, causing the storms to arise from nowhere. So imagine with me, if you will, the chaos that the disciples were going through when this violent storm hit. Just like any of us may do when a storm hits. The disciples, they were probably out there panicking. They were probably running around on the boat. They wondered what they were going to do, and they wondered what was going to happen to them. Are they going to get swallowed up by the storm? Or what? You know, they panicked because the storm threatened to destroy their lives, or so they thought. They also panicked because it seemed to them that Jesus was unconcerned and unaware of what was going on. The thing was, they were not asking Jesus to help them. And then, you know what? Of course, it dawns on them that maybe we should wake Jesus up and ask him for help. When they do ask him, they do so by saying, "Teacher, don't you care what happens to us?" How many of us are like that when storms of life hit us? I know I am like that. I have to admit it. I tend to panic sometimes or wonder what is going to happen. Sometimes I even tend to try and minister to myself. And sometimes I may find myself turning to God as a last resort, just like the disciples did. For example, many of you know that in the beginning of May, I made a trip back to see Elizabeth. When I came back, I kind of went through a storm in my life, if you will. When I came back, part of me wanted to be back there. And I told Elizabeth how I hated to leave her and be so far away from her. I told her at another point that I was afraid that I wouldn't see her again. You know what this young girl told me? During her storm that she was facing herself, the storm of cancer, she told me that I would see her again, if not on earth, in heaven. Then just recently she passed away. I didn't make it back to the funeral. But I went through time and a storm of sorrow for the loss of her. And I kept asking myself, why did this happen? You know, we all face storms just like this. Not storms that we think of as with the winds, the rains, the thunder, the lightning coming down on us. So, the storm that the disciples are facing, we may think of that as being those waves and the rains, but it is more of a symbolic storm. It represents to us the storms that we face in our everyday lives. Just as the disciples cried out for help and asked Jesus if he cared, we also find ourselves crying out in times like these. The thing that is most powerful about our text, though, is that it reminds us how God is in control. Just by Jesus speaking out to the wind and the rain, and telling it to be silent and be muzzled. With these words that Jesus spoke, the wind sank, and the wind and the rain calmed. This is the power that Jesus has in our lives even today. God is in control, even if we do not think He is. When we read this text, we are reminded that we are not alone in the storms of life. Sometimes we may try to go through those storms on our own. Who knows? Maybe the disciples were out there trying to do just that. Maybe they were saying to themselves, you take the sail, you grab the oar, before they cry out to Jesus. When they did cry out for help, they found out that Jesus was there and that He responded to them. You know, this text reminds us that all we need to do is trust in God, and that God will help us through the times of storms in our lives. You know, we do not need to go through the sorrowful times in our lives alone, or the disappointing times of loss of a job. We do not need to go through times of uncertainty on our own. We do not need to go through life's problems, or through the anxious times, or even through the times of temptation alone. Because God is there, calming those sorrows, calming the disappointments, calming the anxieties, calming the temptations, calming the problems, and calming our uncertainties in life. You know, I found this to be so true last weekend. I tell you, you never know how God is going to show up to you when the storms hit in your life. God can show up through just a hug, a word of encouragement, through a phone call, or another random act of kindness. I found God calming my storm of sorrow through the many hugs that I received last week, and through the many words of encouragement that I heard spoken to me. You know, God helped calm my storm. All I needed to do was trust in Him. I just needed to believe for myself that Elizabeth was with Him and that I would see her again. When I started to believe that, you know what? The storm was lifted from me. Sure. When we go through storms like this, and when we come out on the other side, there will be tough times ahead. But the comfort is knowing that God is with us, and that He is walking with us each step of the way through that storm and through the times that we face afterwards. Through the words of our text today, we are reminded that just as God helped the disciples through the storm that they were facing out at sea, and just as God helped to calm my storm, you know what? He too can help calm your storm. All you need to do, and all we need to do, is trust in Him. Have faith in Him, and believe that He is with us always, through the good times and through the bad, and wherever we are in life. No matter what the circumstance, remember this: God is with you, calming the storm.